Hello, everyone. This is Melissa Lentz. I'm the Director of Education at OSEG, and I'd like to welcome you to our webcast today, during which we will present NIST and ISO and SOC 2, oh my, making sense of third-party risk compliance requirements. We are very glad you can join us for this event. Third-party risk management is laden with acronyms, and it can be a challenge to keep up with terms, especially when transitioning between compliance frameworks and regulations. What do they all mean, and which ones do you need? In this webinar, our compliance experts will explore the most important third-party compliance acronyms you need to know going into the rest of 2023. Today, we are pleased to be joined by Alastair Parr, Senior Vice President of Global Products and Services with Prevalent, and Thomas Humphreys, Compliance Expert and Content Manager with Prevalent. We are glad that you could join us today as they spell out the most relevant regulations and frameworks you need to know. But before we start, I'd like to take a minute to go over a few housekeeping notes. First, regarding continuing education credit, we provide NASBA-approved CPE credit to you for participation in live webinars if you have an OSEG All Access Pass, which you can purchase individually or as part of a company subscription. The All Access Pass includes many benefits in addition to CPE credit for webcasts, such as access to all OSEG resources and on-demand education series. So if you don't already have a pass, I would encourage you to check it out on the OSEG site. If you do have an All Access Pass and would like a certificate of completion for CPE for this event, please be sure to stay with us for the entire hour and to answer all the polls through the polling function in our webinar platform. These are requirements for receiving CPE credit for this event. And please note, certificates of completion for CPE credit are available only for live events. They are not available for viewing archived webinars. Additionally, if you need CPE credit only for OSEG certifications, your webinar attendance will be automatically tracked in the certification dashboard on the OSEG site. You will not need to upload your certificates of completion for OSEG certifications. Second, regarding the recording from this webcast, we will have the recording of this event posted on the OSEG website. Just log into the site, go to the Resources tab, select Webinar Recordings, and then this webcast. Anyone with an All Access Pass may view this recording. Third, regarding our audience feedback, please feel free to submit your questions during our event today. If our presenters do not have the opportunity to respond directly during the webinar, they will be able to respond to you via email after the event. Additionally, we value your opinions and encourage you to submit the evaluation offered after the webinar. Fourth, regarding upcoming events and activities, please watch your email for announcements from OSEG about other upcoming webinars. You can view information about these upcoming webcasts on the OSEG site. So today we will address the following learning objectives. We will define models such as SIG, ISO 27001, SOC 2, and SCA, explore the real difference between FISMA and NIST for third-party management, understand sanctions such as OFAC and regulations such as OSFI, and identify the most important mandates for third-party risk and why they are important. But before we hand over the presentation to our speakers, we'd like to offer our first poll. And again, please be sure to answer this poll question by responding in the poll bubble on your screen if you are interested in receiving CPE credit for this event. Please note that we will email certificates of completion for this webinar in a day or two to all participants who meet all the criteria for CPE credit. The first poll question is, do you have an OSEG All Access Pass, which is a paid membership that will enable you to receive CPE credit for this event? Your options here are, yes, I have an All Access Pass that will enable me to receive a certificate of completion for this event if I attend the entire meeting and answer all the polls, or no, I do not have an All Access Pass, so I understand I will not receive CPE credit for this event. So as you answer this poll, I'd like to hand over the presentation to our speakers to begin our discussion today.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Melissa. And hello, Thomas. Thank you for joining me today.
Hello. Good to be here.
Thanks, Thomas. So you were joined today, of course, by Alastair Parr speaking. So I am the SVP of Products and Services over here at Prevalent, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Thomas Humphreys, who is our content manager as well. So I suppose the initial question, hello. I suppose the initial question for us to answer is, why on earth are we qualified to be spending this time with you today? Why should you be spending the next 50 minutes or so? Apart from indulging us and enjoying the timbre of our voices, what value are you expected to get out of it? So I myself come from an auditing background. I've audited hundreds of third-party programs to my joy over the decades. And I've also had the fortune of seeing hundreds of different third-party programs in action. So not just from an individual vendor perspective, but of course also understanding what works, what doesn't work, what are the associated regulations and obligations being placed on that programs, and more importantly, how are people actually responding to those in an effective and proportionate manner? So I'm aiming to distill what I can from that experience today. I am joined by, of course, Thomas, who, Thomas, if you'd like to give a bit of an intro on your background and why you're here.
Absolutely. And yes, in a similar vein to Alastair, I am also from an auditing background. I spent the best part of 10 years working for certification bodies, principally helping organizations through ISO certifications, so like of security, business continuity, quality, and so on and so forth, working both in the United Kingdom and in Singapore. So I've seen many organizations go from strength to strength, utilizing standards, best practice frameworks. And what makes it particularly interesting, of course, is when you see the growth of those organizations as standards change, update, and new and emerging topics as well. And I'm here with you in Prevalent, working to develop assessments, third-party assessments and content focused on many of the standards and best practices that we'll be talking about today.
Lovely. Thank you, Thomas. And thank you for joining me. I'm looking forward and excited to see what we're going to glean from the next session. So,
Absolutely.
What are we going to be covering off? There is, as I'm sure everybody is fully aware, an abundance of acronyms in this space. Now, the acronyms traverse, of course, the vendors, the offerings that they have, techniques and mechanisms, but more prolifically, we do notice they're very heavily associated to regulations and frameworks. So we're going to spend a bit of time diving into some of the more common criteria that we're seeing in the space. We'll touch on how those frameworks are being managed, how third-party risk management is in fact transitioning to third-party lifecycle management as a reaction to that. We'll dive into some of the more common regulations that we're seeing, both, of course, in North America and Europe. And then we'll highlight some of the criteria that we're seeing more specifically at the moment around ESG and anti-bribery management systems in third-party workflows, and touch, of course, on FISMA and NIST. So there's a fair amount that we're going to address today, and it's going to be a bit of a cross-section. We'll be touching things from a high level in the sense of programmatically, how do we approach and manage these things, down to some of the specifics. So what, from a good practice standpoint, should we be considering to help address NIST or ISO requirements, and where does, say, SIG fall into this this Scrabble board of acronyms that we see in the space? So moving forwards, just to begin, why is this the case? Why are we actually seeing this this evolution and this abundance of acronyms? The reality is that we're seeing that the third-party ecosystem across organizations is getting increasingly complex. The modern enterprise does have a broad expanding network of third parties, fourth parties, nth parties that are ultimately facilitating and supporting them as they start outsourcing services. The days of having dedicated on-prem infrastructure are becoming less and less common on the basis that we can outsource these to cloud hosting partners and providers who have the resilience, the scale, and the capability to be able to support businesses. And of course, that's been accelerated by the likes of modern technology and, of course, COVID as well. Now, as a result of that, when you actually start looking at the typical third party, the ecosystem and landscape of third parties has expanded, and has expanded pretty dramatically. We see different business areas ultimately requiring more third-party outsourced services. And as that's expanded, there's an expectation across the board and across the business that we are managing these in an effective way. And when I say effective, what we're talking about here is the flexibility to be able to manage those third parties, the ability to demonstrate cost savings to the business as we start applying all these outsourcing mechanisms and measures, the efficiency to be able to onboard and drive and manage these vendors in a way that's scalable and ultimately effective, And then, of course, having the expertise in-house. So the likes of Thomas operating in organizations to be able to drive and guide good practice. So when you start looking at that, that's certainly a difficult challenge when you start looking at the scale perspective. And that's compounded by the fact that when we start seeing this expanded, attack surface area of a third party, and that's of course demonstrated by the sheer volume of data breaches, hacks, ransomware that we're seeing in the space these days, there is of course a ever-increasing subset of areas that we aim to investigate when we look at these third parties. Historically, we tend to see people siloing these functions. So you have information security, and the InfoSec teams dealing with that in isolation. You might have compliance and ethics managing ESG and anti-bribery and corruption. You might see the legal teams working on privacy or privacy if you prefer. But really, ultimately, when you look at it, a single third party has the opportunity to be able to be assessed in a broad grouping of areas. The landscape is broad. Traceability of materials through procurement, code of conduct, sanctions, health and safety, resilience, of course. There is a lot to consider, a lot to review, and potentially a lot of risk that impacts different parts of the business. So when we start diving into some of these assessment frameworks, well, really, what are they there to do? Of course, there's assessment frameworks very much focused on the internal part of the business, but they often have clauses and criteria focused on managing the extended enterprise, these third parties. And the reality is, when you look at the functions that these third parties are doing for us, they are really an extension of the business. That previously hard perimeter that you'd expect to see in an organization, when you start looking at the old perimeter models, the inside-out security models, they're relatively dispersed nowadays. And you look at on the right-hand side, all of these vendors, distribution centers, help desk, partners, outsourcers, so on, all of these people are basically a blurred extension of our organization. And that's where you start seeing these frameworks and regulations starting to focus and hone in on those, and why the importance of third-party risk management is expanding.
And
So,
I guess,
yes.
Sorry, Alastair. Yes, and I guess one thing that's always important to note as well is, and I think it's hopefully fairly clear from the last two slides, is that we're not just talking about a single sector or industry, are we? We're seeing more and more industries and sectors increasing in the volume of third parties, of suppliers, and the wider supply chain. Whether it's through industries such as healthcare, embracing more digital transformation, the reliance on more and more application systems and bits of software, for example. There are more and more, or there's a greater realization, I think, that perhaps many industries or sectors that perhaps traditionally we wouldn't have thought about having such a large supply chain or wide supply area actually does so. And so this is relevant across the board.
Very much so. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why we have Thomas Humphreys on the line with us today. Thomas's insights and expertise is certainly invaluable, and very much so. This is a problem that transcends industry. It transcends types of organizations. If you're an SME, if you're a large multi-billion-dollar multinational, or you're listed, you're ultimately dealing with the same things. You might have less bubbles to deal with, but nonetheless, those bubbles are there, and they are perpetually exposing your organization and environment to risk. Thank you, Thomas. So when we start looking at those spheres and domains of areas that actually present risk to the organization, we start seeing the Scrabble board amalgamating into sort of the slide you see in front of you at the moment, which is it's segmented by business area. You tend to see things focusing on cybersecurity, business op resilience, financial risk, compliance, of course. And you can certainly see a lot of acronyms embedded in the compliance piece, which is a broad topic for us today. Broader reputational risks, which actually contribute to the compliance risks as well there, and ESG, which again fall under some of the compliance criteria. So all of these business areas historically managed somewhat independently. A good third-party program now is trying to apply some degree of interactions between the teams, shared cost efficiencies, shared workflows to be able to get this data, aggregate it, use active tools to pull that data in, rather than just dealing with whatever they can. So there's a broad set of areas with a lot of criteria. When you start looking at a single third party, as it goes through the journey of onboarding through to offboarding in their life cycle, we'll touch on it in a bit more detail later on. These are all the things that we typically see getting applied. And equally, they have their own regulations and frameworks that feed into how we actually manage these distinctive risk areas. Before we dive into some of those assessment frameworks from a higher level, Thomas, is there anything you want to comment or contribute on this slide?
Yes, and it's so one of the things I've sort of noted, and I think this slide demonstrates it very well, is you mentioned, obviously we'll see throughout the discussion today and the concept of the sort of TPRM and wider life cycle model. It's where organizations, perhaps, or some organizations, have been traditionally focused around areas such as information or cybersecurity, data privacy, for example. Embedding new and emerging topics such as ESG, for example, and particularly when we're trying to organize it all into a consistent approach to managing risk, to managing third parties in the supply chain, this is where some of the difficulties can arise. And it's not only being mindful of those new terms and topics, such as environmental and social factors, for example, but how would you bring them into something that perhaps you've already have, but it's focused on cybersecurity. And so one of the challenges being able to work out, when we're looking at so many different types or areas of risk, how can we bring them together so we have that consistent process? But yes, this is definitely one area I think we're seeing there's being a bit of a challenge for many companies, is how do we adopt best practice, but across a wider range of I guess risk areas or risk types.
That's a good point, Thomas. So certainly, yeah, I certainly echo that, which is, as we converge these workflows and models for these different risk areas, as much as they are very distinct in their criteria and what they're trying to achieve, the process, and I'm sure we can both safely say from an audit perspective, is often very similar. Yes, the aggregation model might be slightly different, the source feeds might be different, but you're managing it the same way. Whether it's an ESG risk, a cybersec risk, or a financial risk, the reality is the process is consistent in, we find the issue, we identify it, we capture it, we validate it through whatever means we need to, and then we track and manage a remediation path for a tolerance level. You have risk appetite levels that you're managing as part of these. You offset that and compare that against the regulations that you have to adhere to, and then you drive that through to a completion, acceptance point, etc. It does transcend each of these areas. So that convergence is actually a positive, because you're not making things too disparate between the different business areas. So a good point, Thomas. Thank you. So Thomas, I wonder if you give us a bit of an insight into some of the more common assessment frameworks that we see out in the space.
Absolutely. And I don't want to make it more complicated than everything we've just touched on, but the assessment frameworks, obviously we're not just talking about one, but there's a large volume of frameworks, whether they're best practices, regardless of the industry, or whether industry and sector, as well as those that are specific to sectors or topic specific based on a more narrow view of a particular sort of field of study. And this, again, when you're looking at different acronyms, you can apply it to different frameworks. And having that question around, where do we start? Which assessment do we use? Which standard is the right standard or the right requirements for us, can be a bit of a minefield in itself. As we can see on the screen, on the right-hand side, I've highlighted 4 of perhaps the most well-known assessment frameworks. ISO 27001, now moved to the 2022 version. SIG, or Standardized Information Gathering Assessments. SOC 2, and NIST 853. Now, I've put up those 4 particularly, as I say, because they are, when you look at the wider view of information and cybersecurity frameworks, these are certainly perhaps the most widely used assessments. Each of them slightly different in their own right, but then at the same time, each of them have a lot of consistencies, which we'll go into in a short while. But beyond this, or outside of this, as you'll see at the bottom, there are other sector and topic specific frameworks still covering the likes of information cybersecurity, even privacy for that matter as well. So whether it's areas around healthcare, the likes of HIPAA and high trust, for example, to educational areas in HECFAT, or areas that are focusing on payment processing and the security practices and processes around managing sort of card payment systems in PCI DSS. So just on the page there, we have 6 examples of completely separate, say, standards, frameworks, and best practices, all of which are used largely internationally. Certainly ISO, SOC, and NIST, I guess more so than others, and PCI, SIG, HECFAT, NIST, generally more US sort of focused or centric. However, it's important to note that despite so many different standards and frameworks out there, and as we'll see shortly, regulations as well, it is important to note, and certainly a lot of comfort as well, in knowing that there is a very consistent approach in how all of these frameworks are structured. What I mean by that is the way they all develop best practices for securing data and information, whether it's through technical controls around managing access, to governance controls around continuity and managing incident response, to securing having secure best practices through how you train and make staff aware of how they should be using and interacting with data, for example. And all of these systems, all of these standards and frameworks all identify the same type of controls. Some of the nuances, of course, is in some of the terminology, but there is this structured approach that we can see, and consistency in the type of best practices for securing that data and information. Perhaps not surprisingly as well is, and this is increasing as well, is the level of interconnected mappings between these frameworks. So looking at the 27001 and particularly the new version of the standard, there's a stronger link between what ISO say and what NIST says in its 853 framework. And we see that similarly across the likes of SIG related to ISO and SOC and NIST respectively. So you can start to see that consistency in terms of not only the same controls and how they're structured, but you can start to see quite quickly how each of these assessments are interlinked as well. And then finally, all of these frameworks are regularly updated as well. Some of them go through an annual refresher, some of them less frequently, but the ultimate aim is to make sure that new and emerging topics and best practices are adopted as well. So each of these frameworks, by their respective standards bodies, do go through regular reviews and updates to make sure that they remain fit for purpose and relevant. And just finally, as I say, mentioning again that it's important to note these are not industry specific for those 4 in the box to the right. So regardless of sector, regardless of geography, regardless of size of organization, whether you adopt ISO or SIG or NIST or SOC or a blend of multiple frameworks, is certainly achievable. And in some cases, something that we're seeing more and more, where companies are recognizing the best practices achieved through multiple frameworks.
Thank you, Thomas. I want to encourage people as well. I've certainly seen a few questions starting to come in as we've been talking through here. We do have a Q&A section just to reinforce at the end of the session. We'll try and address some of the more common questions at that point in time. But a few that have come in specifically on this slide, Thomas, is you had to pick one framework, assessment framework to leverage that wasn't sector specific. What would you pick?
So given my background and areas I've worked in before, ISO I'd always focus on. I'd say ISO design all of their standards and frameworks to not focus on the sector or industry, and perhaps equally importantly, not focus on a size of organization as well. What I like about ISO particularly is its focus on getting governance and risk right first time, as sort of scene setting before looking at control and policy and process as well. Although having said that, NIST is a good area to point out. NIST, for those who are maybe not as familiar, it's a US focused framework which was initially designed for US federal agencies and their respective supply chain, but we're finding more and more organizations who are not US federal agencies are adopting NIST because of the technical depth that the framework goes into, which again can be used regardless of a sector or industry.
No, thank you, Thomas. That's a good point. That addresses a couple of the questions that have come in there. The other thing to reinforce as well, I think that localization is a valid point. I've certainly seen there's been an influx of SOC 2 documentation and evidence collection perspective dealing with vendors more recently, typically with larger organizations and larger vendors we deal with. That's become more prolific. The SIG itself is certainly well adopted in North America, less so in Europe. And rightly, as Thomas mentioned, NIST tends to be more technical and more North America centric. ISO 27001 and the subset 27002, etc. We have seen being more common globally. When you start dealing with, of course, tapping into your experience, Thomas, in Singapore and APAC as a territory, and certainly in EMEA, I've certainly seen a fair bit more focused on ISO as opposed to some of the other frameworks, if you'd agree.
Absolutely, yes. And certainly it being one of the few that are on the screen now that are certifiable as well is certainly a strong pull to companies adopting ISO frameworks. But yes, certainly across APAC and other countries and areas, it's certainly the most popular, or certainly the most recognized assessment framework.
Good point. Another good point there about the external validation that you might get from being 27001 certified or having a SOC 2 Type 2, showing incremental evolution of compliance and good practice is certainly a good thing.
Absolutely, and just lastly on that as well. So you mentioned quite rightly that we are seeing a wider use of things like SOC 2 reports, and our companies saying, we're using SOC 2 best practice. We've gone through an attestation. We've gone through formal audit. And this is where the benefit of the interconnected mappings can come in so successfully as well, to work out whether the use of a SOC 2 meets your own internal requirements. If, say, internally you adopt 27,000 best practice or NIST or SIG or something else, being able to map the requirements between those assessments and those frameworks can make it easier to understand they're achieving this level of compliance, and where does that fit within our own use cases or our own sort of internal assessments that we're using as well.
Thank you, Thomas. Very good point. So I think it's about time to move on to another poll. We'd love to hear from you now. You'll see the poll appear. And the general question is, what is your view on using a managed service to do the heavy lifting for aspects of third-party programs today? Now, of course, one of the criteria we have for asking this is that we are always interested in the insourcing versus outsourcing model from an efficiency standpoint. And we've started to see organizations generally being open to an outsourcing model on the basis you get a degree of efficiency. Now, a managed service for us, what we normally tend to see here, is a bit of a cross-section. You can see this by some of the questions here. It might be importing and ingesting data feeds and data sets that get interpreted using passive monitoring, as much as it might be the assessment models. Because of course, there's two models there. There's aggregating data passively, and then there's aggregating data actively. So by all means, I'd love to get your inputs on whether you essentially need help chasing answers, being more of the assessment model, whether you need help to get off manual activities and establish a program that scales, whether if you're not exactly sure if it's right for you and you're more of an insourcing model mindset, or whether you're using a product or service for your third-party needs and you're good. It's certainly going to help us get a bit of insight into understanding the gradual maturity of the space as well here. So we'll leave that up for a little bit, but while we do that, we just wanted to dive over specifically to TPRM to TPLM, another acronym to throw your way, because why not? We're on the subject today. So TPRM for us, from a terminology standpoint, is third-party risk management. TPLM is third-party lifecycle management. And when you start speaking to the various analysts in the space, focusing on maturity and evolving maturity, this is the trend that you're seeing. TPRM is ultimately evolving into TPLM. I think TPLM has always existed, lifecycle management has always existed, but with the capabilities of tools and workflows now, the aperture is adjusted, so people are looking at that broader space and piece as opposed to the individual components. So this is a very reductive slide of looking at it, but when you start looking at the criteria, you start, of course, with sourcing and RFP. You transition over there to the contract stage, moving forwards to supply inventory and intake process, then prioritizing the suppliers before finally conducting your risk assessments for analysis. Now, this is more of the upfront journey, but historically, we have seen people tend to segment some of the compliance and regulatory requirements on the tail end in the risk assessment piece. There might be the odd contractual clause embedded in stage 2, or they might ask a generic question in sourcing an RFP, but they're relatively disjointed. Now, what we're seeing as a trend in the space is people are being aware of those obligations and embedding them at the start of the journey, asking more prescriptive questions in the RFP and RFX phase, embedding those prescriptive requirements as clauses in the contractual stage. And then once you start looking at the existing inventory, that's where they'll start establishing the impacts of vendors based on who they are and what they do, so that they can associate those to the right questions for the right risks, for the right frameworks and the right regulations. So it's an interesting trend as you see things move left on that journey. And that extends to when you actually look at the full picture here, beyond assessment and remediations, into monitoring, ongoing validation, SLA performance management for the operational resilience piece. And then finally, at the very tail end, that onboarding, the offboarding and termination phase. So this is, if someone's talking to you about TPLM, the third-party lifecycle, this is the distilled view of it. You have sourcing and selection up front, through to the offboarding and termination phase, and every single step that you see in front of you has distinctive workflows that drive good practice, capturing of regulatory obligations, identification of risks and issues, and then finally validation and confirmation of suitability and the potential threat associated to the third parties. Thomas, any questions or commentary that you might have yourself?
Absolutely, and I guess one of the immediate sort of question that comes to mind is, when we think about, and again we may see in a little while, more and more regulators and sectors or industries, are paying more attention to the wider supply chain, whether it's to some specifics such as ESG or more generically around, the effectiveness of an organization's, management of its supply chain. So when we get these new emerging or updated sort of regulations and legislation, would you say it's easier then to adopt what those legislations and regulations ask for if we have a life cycle model rather than a perhaps traditional TPRM?
That's a good point, good question, Thomas. So the thing that I'm starting to see myself is that by moving things up front, it becomes more of a question of have we applied the relevant obligations to the third parties at the outset, so they are legally beholden to oblige. The challenge we're seeing here from a regulatory standpoint is we ask, please, later in the cycle, at which point the vendor tends to have the money, they tend to be providing the service, and they're surprisingly less responsive in a lot of cases. Not all vendors, of course, but in many cases. And the reality is, if you're asking please, rather than saying, you have contractually obliged to this as part of that procurement upfront cycle, you will see a reduction in quality, a reduction in engagement. So the value of moving things to the left here and embedding the regulatory obligations in the sourcing and selection process and the onboarding and the inherent risk calculations means you understand which vendors are in scope associated to the reg. You understand which vendors have demonstrated compliance or stated as such, and you understand what sticks you have rather than just carrots in order to get them to participate. And that pays dividends in the later cycles.
Absolutely, and I guess thinking from an internal perspective as well, one challenge we do see, or when we're speaking to companies, is where there are so many voices in an organization, so many different business functions or operational units all have a say, of course, in terms of their own relationship with suppliers and the supply chain. So I guess having and creating that journey, if you will, in a full life cycle and looking at from whether it's from procurement side, from the security side, whether it's from some risk and governance side, I guess it'll make it easier from an engagement perspective internally. If you're an organization looking to say, this is our business case to going on that journey of a TPLM, rather than perhaps the more traditional model.
Yeah, good point, Thomas. Very good point. Now, I'd love to dive into a few specific, localized regulations or sector-specific regulations, if you don't mind, Thomas. I know you've got a great lens on this that I can certainly learn from myself.
Absolutely. So yes, as the title on the slide, regulation. So as I previously indicated, we are seeing more visibility from regulators that essentially are saying to organizations, saying to the wider industry and to sectors as well, we need you to tell us about your third parties, about not just how you're managing them, but you're managing them in the right way. You're managing in the sensible way, and where there are risks and issues, that we have a clear process for you to manage them. And we can see this coming from many different avenues. One area that unfortunately is becoming more common, as we've seen over the last certainly 2+ years, is the volume of vulnerabilities and threats and attacks. Certainly, I start to lose count of the volume of ransomware attacks, for example, that impact wider supply chains, and as you'd expect, naturally, this scares organizations, this scares industries as well, particularly when they start to face some hefty issues in terms of data loss. And so more and more regulators are taking a more, I guess, focused approach on TPRM and the wider supply chain. Two organizations you can see on the screen, Bank of England and the PRA, or managed by Prudential, and OSFI, which is a Canadian a regulator. And what's been interesting is to take the PRA as in the first instance, they developed a very thorough framework for managing third parties and for assessing your third parties and for having a wider supply chain risk management program. What's been interesting there is that OSFI in Canada has taken the model of the PRA or the PRA regulation and adopted it themselves, and they've just this year gone through a formal sort of release or go live of this regulation that, as I say, mirrors a lot of what PRA is focused on. And so this is two examples from the financial sector across both the UK and in Canada, but we can also see it across Europe as well. And I guess we can expect to see it in some capacity in the US of saying, here's a clear approach to managing your third party process. And again, it's not just saying, do you know your suppliers and third parties, and have you got a contract in place, but the details of that contract, the details of concentration of suppliers where you're using single source supply, how you're adjusting and managing risk, how you're managing data breaches and incidents and necessary processes to inform your key stakeholders and shareholders as well. So this is a good example of some quite major players in the financial sector who have been stressing this need for, we need a greater oversight in how these third parties are being managed, but certainly from the risk perspective. And we can see this increasing in other sectors as well, such as education, certainly from healthcare, which, to be fair, has always been, as you know, fairly heavily regulated. But again, greater adoption of or focus from a supply chain perspective. So this is something that's definitely not going away, and in many cases, as I say, we're sort of expecting it's going to increase as well. And finally, from these regulators as well, it's I mentioned at the start the likes of ISO and NIST demonstrate a lot of best practices for security controls, for example, and supply chain controls as well, and supplier management. And what's interesting is when you look at these regulators, such as OSFI and Prudential or the PRA standard, and there's a lot of terminology that very closely mirrors the likes of ISO, NIST, and others as well. So it's obviously very comforting to know that they recognize these as best practice frameworks to use in their respective industries as well.
Thank you, Thomas. And how does that apply when we start looking at it from a national level as well? So I appreciate there's certainly an increase in national defined standards, requirements, and frameworks, both in North America and of course in EMEA as well.
Absolutely, and it's in some ways can become tricky and trickier. We've seen that in the US, particularly from a privacy perspective. You look at some of the perhaps more notable ones, such as CCPA and CPRA in California. We've got HIPAA, national standards on the screen as well from a healthcare perspective, and ADPPA, American Data Privacy and Protection Act, are just a few examples where at a national level, governments are trying to impose or set, again, best practice sort of standards and expectations. So to take HIPAA, for example, they already have two very clear rules, one from a security perspective, one from a privacy perspective. And obviously the privacy perspective focusing on the likes of EPHI, or electronic public so personal health information, sorry. And so yes, we are seeing again a steady increase at a national level, whether it's to protect consumer data, but also to drive that best practice, whether it's against a particular industry, so healthcare in the event of HIPAA, or more sort of countrywide, statewide. We do get other organizations as well, such as the NCSC in the UK, National Cybersecurity Centre. So it's a part of government. It's a part of a company called GCHQ. And again, at a wider level, what they do is they set frameworks and best practice guidance, specifically for the likes of SMEs. So whether it's the advent of more and more sort of threats, such as some of these wider ransomware threats we've seen, or whether it's setting best practice expectations. So, for example, minimum cybersecurity practice. And the NCSC, again, nationwide, pushes out some of this guidance to say, if you're an SME, regardless of your industry, these are best practices that we recommend you adopt. And that's an important word there, to say recommend rather than enforce. As you know, when it comes to some of the more national requirements, it's more a case of it will be in place rather than it will not be in place, or it doesn't have to be in place. So the likes of HIPAA, which is more focused on if you work in the healthcare sector or you're a healthcare organization, these are the areas that you do need to implement, rather than the likes of NCSC, where it's best practice guidance.
That's a good point, Thomas. We're certainly seeing a lot more. The language is key and critical, as I'm sure many of the line all certainly know. Language and interpretation of that language is key, and the same we often see when you start seeing these new regulations come out is a abundance again, or a plethora of articles, blogs, news sites that dissect these regulations and interpret some of the findings and ultimately specify what you need to do. And quite often they can be recommendations. It's more about being able to communicate what you're doing, having the appropriate visibility, and having the appropriate mechanisms to be able to track and drive things forward. So that's a very valid point to raise there, Thomas. Thank you. Thomas, I'd love to get your view as well, if I may, on an emerging trend that we tend to be seeing at the moment, which is focused on ESG and anti-bribing corruption. That's certainly a growing topic, and we've seen that grow exponentially across Europe as well. But have you got any thoughts at all on the UN Global Compact specifically?
Yes, this is an interesting one, again, very much, I think, even now in the emerging phase, it's an interesting area, ESG, because in many ways you could say that some of these areas have been around for a long, long time. And you have to look at, say, ISO standards in environmental and health and safety, or sorts of social accountability, and some of these have been around for 10 or plus years. But this consolidated effort of having a wider focus on ESG, and obviously anti-bribery, ABMS forms a core part of that. One of the challenges, and we are seeing a lot more, I guess, concentration and focus, is on having a recognized single source of truth, whether it's a best practice framework or an agency or an organization. So UN Global Compact, which is of the UN, the United Nations, it's a voluntary based initiative, but it focuses on essentially commitments from organizations, from business leaders, to implement sustainability principles. We can see two examples here, whether it's on human rights and the adoption of Human Rights Act and human rights best practices, and as well as labor rules as well, in terms of, as you can see on the screen, the abolition of child labor, fair pay, abolition of forced labor, and many other areas that are sensitive, but very, very critical as well. And these are areas that, as I say, are quite pertinent from an ESG perspective. So organizations who do sign up to the Global Compact means they're committed to focusing on some of these, let's say, very pertinent areas as a way to demonstrate this is our approach, and this is how we're approaching some of these acts, these global acts, or how we're monitoring effective, proper, and true labor best practices, for example, when it comes to the supply chain. And I think this is the key thing here, isn't it? It's not just saying us as an organization adopting best practices, but it's saying beyond that, when we look at our wider supply chain and the type of organizations we're dealing with to supply our critical products and services, we're also doing steps to make sure that they adopt the same practices. And so this concerted effort that, as say, the UN have adopted, and it's increasing as well. And I think this is good. This is the key piece to note. Not just UN Global Compact, but other organizations and entities are adopting a lot of best practice standards, which I think are going to become the norm, particularly as ESG does increase or becomes a de facto standard that organizations use, when engaging with third parties in the wider supply chain.
Thank you, Thomas. It's probably prudent now to actually dive a bit into some of the workflows associated to that. And for those who were listening earlier on, you may recall that I mentioned that there's a lot of overlap between each of these regulations and the interpretation and application of it when it comes to third parties. So if we're looking specifically at, say, ESG and ABMS as a workflow, we'll touch on some of the shared methodology here. And one of the first things you'd expect to do when you start looking at, say, ESG is governing the identification and reporting methodologies that you're looking to do. So we need to understand what is the workflow that we're going to follow to be able to identify the vendors that are applicable to this, and then how are we actually going to report back on this? How are we going to gauge and grade them? How do we ascertain if they're fit for purpose and then drive forward? We need to understand who the vested parties are, both externally and internally within the business. If we're driving these programs, we might want to target specific team members, for example, or business divisions, privacy, compliance, ethics, whoever it may be. We need to understand what their needs are and make sure we communicate effectively to them. And then we need to look at things such as, well, what are the common domains that we're getting similar information for say, ESG and ABMS? Are there existing question sets or data capture points that we're already leveraging in the procurement and RFX processes? And then specify what we're going to do with the data when we get it. How are we going to output it? How are we going to track it consistently? And to touch on what Thomas said earlier on, we want to have a consistent methodology of having the centralized domain environment, risks, whatever it may be. And then we need to find our sequencing. How are we actually going to capture that in a consistent way, both initially and then ongoing? So when you start looking at that as a process, really you're looking at an implementation, a review, and an enhancement process. For those who are old enough to remember the plan, do, check, act models from back in the day, tied to ISO and similar to that. We need to understand what it is we're trying to achieve, document the workflows, sign that off, do a pilot as necessary, review the criteria, make sure that the stakeholders are able to get the information that they need, and then iterate as necessary. So as we're defining this, it's again consistent beyond ESG and ABMS. Samples and pilot processes are very useful when we do these. We need to pilot these journeys to make sure that we're not overly complicating the workflows and that they're effective and we get the right data, because you might need to tweak the volume of data in order to meet the regulations that align to you. And once you've passed and are happy with the pilot outputs, that's when you can start looking at the big bang. How do we apply this at scale across the organization? But one of the key messages I tend to hear on this is, don't try to make it your magnum opus. If you spend too much time driving and trying to get it to just exactly where it needs to be on day one, you'll likely never launch the program. We always recommend that iteration. So understand what good looks like against your regulations, apply it, and then establish your iteration path, that enhancement journey. And a big part of that is profiling and tiering, actually understanding who we need to speak to, and minimizing that to only core essential third parties associated with the regulation. Then we could target remediation activities. We know we're dealing and spending resource on the right thing. There's no such thing as an over-resourced third-party lifecycle team. If there is, I've yet to see one. There might be the odd unicorn out there, but they're pretty rare. Yeah. And don't try and create a model which relies on the data the business doesn't have. So there's no harm in having aspirations and long-term objectives, but be pragmatic, be realistic, and that affects your risk appetite as well. Be proportionate here. We may all want everything to be green on our spreadsheets, and auditors, of course, love trying to find any amber or red. That's what you're paying them for. But the reality is these programs are iterative, and there's a consistent theme with a lot of these regulations and frameworks out there is they encourage iteration, they encourage good behavior and good practice. It's quite often about how do you continuously improve as opposed to, and then track and govern that, as opposed to thou shalt or thou shalt not consistently. Thomas, have you got any points you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'd agree with everything you've just said there. And actually, do you know what, the iteratively improve final bullet on the previous slide, I think, yes, you could easily bring across to this one as well. And particularly when you're referring to the likes of, what best reflects your risk appetite. If you take one look at it, and then you never look at it again, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years down the line, for sure, it's changed as new and emerging threats and risks come into play. Different types of suppliers, expansion or reduction in suppliers and the supply chain as well. So that continual, to echo your, yes, the old school phrase, plan, do, check, act is I think is very valuable. Not least, of course, in terms of maturity as well. I think it's always worth highlighting that piece, in that for organizations that have established a TPRM and gone through the stage of a TPLM and wider lifecycle model, you set up your assessments, your frameworks, you're engaged with the third parties, you're generating and managing risk on a year-to-year basis. By going through that continual improvement, that lessons learned, that iterative review cycle, will help when it comes to maturing your program, maturing your framework, and making sure that you're not going back to a vendor 1 year, 2 years down the line, still with exactly the same problems. And so it's very much, yes, a red line item, I think, in terms of make sure you have it, make sure you iteratively review and improve and assess.
That's a good point, Thomas. And certainly, I'm sure, Thomas, you're the same, because I can see that you're answering some of these questions as they're coming in as well. We do encourage you to keep asking questions in the chat. As much as we'll try and reserve some time on the tail end of this, we will do our best to weave some answers into our talk track today, as we have been doing. So please keep them coming, and thank you for those. And just transition for a moment into another poll if we can. So we just want to understand, for those of you out there who are actually looking to augment or establish your risk program, your third-party risk program in the next year. It's a simple question. But really what we're trying to understand is what percentage of the population here, of course, is focusing on iteration. Some of you might have perfected your models. Some of you might be here out of just pure general curiosity, or it might not even be your remit or domain. But nonetheless, it's very useful for us to understand who is iterating, who's focused on that across the broader community. And while you're answering that, by all means, Thomas, I'd love if we can just spend a couple of minutes specifically on FISMA and NIST and your thoughts on that.
Yes, absolutely. Now, we discussed at length today, as the title of the presentation, acronyms, and just breaking down the volume of acronyms across the board. Standardizing terms, definitions, control requirements. The more standardized we can get, the more sort of understanding and awareness we can get, only makes it clearer to an organization when you're starting out, but also when you're adopting new frameworks. And one way to do that is to have a clear body or bodies or set of organizations that have those baselines, have those requirements. So we have two here, both US, FISMA, Federal Information Security Management Act. It's US government legislation focused on federal agencies. The main aim is to adopt an information security program. They establish cybersecurity best practice standards, but their aim, given that it is focused on federal agency, is to protect government information, operations, and government assets. They have a high-level set of requirements and a deep dive set of, it's in the hundreds of security controls, so it's very in-depth. On the other side of the coin, we have NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology. In a similar vein to ISO, they have hundreds of different standards out there for individual products to topics such as information security, cybersecurity, privacy, artificial intelligence, so on and so forth. It's a non-regulated agency of the US. And as I say, one of the interesting things about NIST is we're finding there's a wider adoption, not just in the US, but globally as well, given the level of depth the NIST framework goes into. So non-regulated, but still focusing on best practice standards. There actually are NIST standards, security standards, that are used to help achieve a level of FISMA compliance. So if you're an agency setting an information security program under the guise of FISMA, there are NIST standards that are dedicated just to implementing and achieving that level of compliance. As you can see on the screen, I mentioned this covers a lot of different areas, but certainly information security, privacy, supply chain and risk management standards, or the NIST RMF, are perhaps some of them more commonly known and widely adopted. And all of these areas in some capacity fit into those high-level requirements and control points that FISMA expect government agencies and federal agencies to adopt. So there's a lot of similarity between the two. Both go to a very technical level, perhaps NIST more so than FISMA. Just to clarify that, they still expect some baseline requirements around, say, access control or continuity or development standards, but they then go into a very sort of detailed overview and expectation in terms of what that means, perhaps more so than the likes of ISO and SIG and other adopted or equally adopted frameworks. So there's a close relationship between FISMA and NIST, but it's a good example of where there are acts or legislations and standards that are adopted actually nationally, in some cases globally, that act as a good baseline because of that standardization in terms of terms and terminologies and definitions and what controls should be doing or how they should be implemented.
Thank you, Thomas. Now, I appreciate we're running a bit short on time now, There's certainly been a very good dialogue and conversation. So we'll cherry pick a couple of these questions on the tail end, but while we're just composing those and consolidating those, just a brief outline specifically on Prevalent as us as an organization, and how we actually support this. So first and foremost, we appreciate when we start looking at scale and efficiency of these programs, we need to have associating technology that be able to support it. So we look at that life cycle that we've discussed when we're dealing with these regulations and obligations, and we've essentially built a platform around that. So a platform enables us to do it at scale and effectively. It allows us to track that life cycle in one single coherent place, and allows us to ingest the passive monitoring capabilities to be able to track things that might contradict or evidence the fact that vendors aren't actually aligning to the regulatory obligations we place upon them in contracts. And we do that, of course, within the platform itself. We have the ability to send out the assessments to complement those. We're able to do things like AI and machine learning to track and report specifically on failures and deficiencies, and building things like risk appetites. And then, of course, build the associated reporting to communicate that information to the broader business and ecosystem. We focus on the life cycle specifically. So we're dealing with our technology and, of course, the people that support that, the likes of Thomas and myself. We have managed service teams that ultimately drive that life cycle from start to finish on the behalf of customers. But really, the business problem that we're addressing aligns to what we've discussed today, which is we appreciate there's multiple components, multiple teams, and multiple needs tied to the different risk domains associated to that landscape of third parties. And the way that you approach that is that you need to use the right tools, the right capabilities, and the right expertise to be able to do it effectively and at scale. So we'll just cherry pick two of the questions that I've seen come in so far today before we hand back to the lovely Melissa. But the first question, Thomas, I wonder if you'd be able to take, which is, how on earth are you finding out and staying on top of the various regulations as they come out, and how do you ascertain if they're applicable to you or not?
Yes, that's an interesting point, and yes, there's a lot of them, as you can see. There's various ways we can do it. Certainly, there are. If you're already in an industry or sector that you know is regulated or heavily regulated, the obvious ones being financial, so the financial sector, sort of healthcare sector, and so forth. Many of the agencies I mentioned, OSFI, for example, from financial, and HIPAA. From a healthcare perspective, many of them will have processes or alert bulletins when sort of standards and regulations get updated. Many of them also give the options to help in the review process as well. When it comes to standards such as ISO and NIST, there is a defined frequency that these standards bodies always go through. ISO, for example, always goes through a 5-yearly review of all of its frameworks. And there are organizations for almost every country in the world who sign up to help ISO develop their frameworks, for example. And so it's just being mindful of the timings when each of these standards get updated. But also when there are new and emerging topics coming up, it's going through the route of asking those sector organizations such as OSFI in terms of what's coming on the horizon. So there are various processes and paths you can go down to stay on top of new and emerging legislations and signing up to different organizations in terms of getting understanding of what's happening next and what's coming on the horizon.
Thank you, Thomas. And I'll put this other question, as it's come up in various shapes and forms over the course of the session. So certainly think we should probably try and address it now if we can, which is, as I speak to the business, I appreciate that there's lots of different requirements aligned to each of these. Now, judging by some of these commentaries, some people are finding it a bit overwhelming on the fact that they're having to track 5, 10, 15 different obligations and regulatory frameworks that align to these business areas. It looks like some people are generally saying, look, let's just focus on one and iterate. Others are focused on that big bang approach. So do you have a preference or any advice that you have for the community on whether we should try to iterate in embedding these regulations into our programs, or should we just push pause? capture this information and try and deal with it en masse.
So yeah, it is very tempting, particularly from a legislation perspective, to push pause and wait. One of the dangers behind that is always going to be, how long do you wait? And as we know, particularly with legislations, regulations, when it comes to the legal perspective, more often than not, it's not on time, and it can take a fair while to get a resolution or decision or framework out. Key starting points I'd always recommend is internally in the business, if you know there are frameworks that the organization is used to, has used, or has experience in, such as ISO or NIST, or something else, that's always a good starting point. Because more often than not, a lot of these, particularly from a regulation standpoint, they are adopting, although they'll have their own terminology, a lot of what they're adopting are practices taken from the likes of ISO or SIG or NIST. To take the OSFI piece, for example, that's been released this year, almost all of what they're requiring organizations to do can be tied back to NIST supply chain management requirements, for example, and similarly to ISO. And obviously that makes it much easier, because if you have that process already adopted in the organization, when it comes to the legislations probing organizations further, you've already got a starting point to say, well, we're adopting best practice internationally or nationally, or across our wide supply chain.
And I certainly support that from a perspective of, as you touched on, Thomas, which is a lot of these regulations go through consultation periods. They test the water with certain criteria to see how the space and the experts in the field react. So there's usually suitable and ample warning on what to expect. And more often than not, they end up being somewhat diluted more than enhanced before that final version comes in through those consultation periods. And I certainly echo as well what Thomas mentioned. I know, Thomas, you and your team spend a lot of time crafting consolidated frameworks that aggregate these various regulations, and there's lots of different repositories out there that will help support that in mapping, one criteria to many, which certainly makes life easier for most. So I encourage people to investigate that, whether that's through Prevalent or the other repositories out there. Thomas, I would say thank you very much. I appreciate that. I know we're running a bit here from a Q&A perspective. Just wanted to hand over to Melissa, if you're still with us.
Great. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank both Alastair and Thomas for joining us today to identify and discuss the most relevant regulations and frameworks that we all need to know. And to our audience, we'd love to have you join us for other upcoming OSEG webinars. Please watch out for emails from OSEG regarding these future events. This concludes our webcast today. Thanks so much for joining us, everyone.